He didn't ask me to marry him. He gave me a deadline. The rain hit my face like needles as I stood on the sidewalk outside my apartment, clutching a suitcase that wasn't even mine anymore, because everything I owned had just been locked behind a door I couldn't open, and the landlord didn't even look at me when he said I had 10 minutes to leave, like I was already invisible, like I didn't exist anymore, and maybe I didn't. Not in a city that measured your worth by the balance in your account and the address on your ID, both of which I had just lost in under 5 minutes. So I stepped into the street because standing still felt like drowning, and the headlights came too fast. A sleek black car cutting through the storm like it owned the road, like it owned everything, and I should have moved. I should have stepped back, but I didn't, because part of me didn't care anymore, and the car stopped inches from me, close enough that I could see my reflection in the polished hood, soaked, shaking, unrecognizable, and then the door opened, slow, deliberate, like even time waited for him, and when he stepped out, the world didn't get louder, it got quieter, like everything around him understood it wasn't important anymore. Tall, composed, wearing a dark coat that didn't seem to register the rain, his eyes finding mine like he already knew me, like he had been looking for me, and that was the moment I should have walked away, but I didn't, because he spoke first, his voice low, steady, controlled. You look like someone who just lost everything. And I almost laughed because it wasn't a question, it was a fact, and something about the way he said it made my chest tighten, like he saw more than he should, like he saw through me. And I hated that. I hated how easily he read me. So I lifted my chin and said nothing, because silence was the only thing I still owned. And he studied me for a second longer, then nodded once, like I had just confirmed something for him, and reached into his coat, pulling out a card. Simple. Expensive. The kind of card you didn't get unless you mattered, and he held it out to me like it weighed nothing, like it wouldn't change. Everything, marry me, he said, just like that. No hesitation, no explanation, like he was offering me a ride instead of a life. And I stared at him because I was sure I misheard, because men like him didn't propose to women like me on sidewalks at midnight in the rain. But he didn't repeat himself, he didn't need to, his eyes didn't waver, and then he added, almost casually, 90 days. That's all I need. And my breath caught because suddenly it wasn't absurd. It was specific. It was real. And that made it worse, because real things could trap you. And I shook my head, stepping back, because whatever game this was, I wasn't playing it. Not with a stranger who looked like danger wrapped in a tailored coat. I don't even know you, I said, my voice sharper than I felt. And something flickered in his expression, not anger, not surprise, something quieter, like amusement that didn't reach his eyes. Adrian Vance, he replied, like that name was supposed to mean something. And maybe it should have, because the way he said it made the air shift, made the city feel smaller, like his name carried weight I couldn't see yet. And then he took a step closer, not enough to touch me, just enough that I could feel the space between us disappear. You don't need to know me, he continued. You need a solution. And I hated that he was right. I hated how easily he reduced my situation to something transactional, like I was a problem to be solved, but my stomach twisted because I did need something, anything, and he knew it, of course he knew it. Men like him always did, and before I could respond, before I could convince myself to walk away, he spoke again, softer this time, but somehow more dangerous. I erase your debt. I give you a place to live. You walk away in 90 days like none of this ever happened. And there it was, the hook, clean, simple, impossible to ignore, because he wasn't offering romance, he was offering survival, and that made it harder to refuse, because survival didn't care about pride, it cared about staying afloat, and my fingers tightened around the handle of my suitcase as my mind raced, calculating risks I didn't understand, consequences I couldn't see, and something in me whispered that this wasn't just a contract, this was a door I wouldn't be able to close once I stepped through it, and I looked at him again, really looked this time, at the calm in his posture, the certainty in his voice, the way the world seemed to bend slightly around him, and I realized something that made my chest go cold. He wasn't asking because he needed me. He was asking because he had already decided, and I was just catching up, and that terrified me more than anything, because it meant my answer didn't matter as much as I wanted it to, and the rain kept falling, steady, relentless, like a countdown I couldn't stop, and he waited, not impatient, not rushed, just certain, like he had all the time in the world, and I had none, And maybe that was the truth. Maybe that was always the truth, and I swallowed hard, my voice barely above a whisper when I finally spoke. What happens if I say no? And for the first time, something shifted in his eyes, something darker, something that made my pulse spike. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of it, like standing too close to the edge of something you couldn't see the bottom of. And he tilted his head slightly, considering me like I was a question with only one answer. And then he said, quietly, almost gently, "Then you walk away tonight." A pause, just long enough to make me think I had a choice. And tomorrow, everything that put you here will still be waiting. And he wasn't threatening me, not directly. But he didn't have to, because reality was already doing that for him. And I stood there in the rain, caught between a life I was losing and a man I didn't understand, holding a card that felt heavier than it should. And somewhere deep down, a thought I didn't want to admit started to form. Not that I trusted him, not that I believed him, but that 90 days might be enough to survive. And I didn't know yet that survival was the beginning of everything I was about to lose. I should have walked away the moment he said 90 days, but instead I took the card. And that was the first mistake I could not undo, because the moment my fingers touched that thick piece of paper, something shifted, like a line I could not see had just been crossed. And he noticed, of course he did, his eyes lowering briefly to my hand before lifting back to my face. Calm, certain, like he had just watched a door close behind me. And I hated that. I hated how easily he read me. So I forced myself to speak, to take back control of something. Anything. "This is insane," I said. But my voice did not sound as strong as I wanted. And he did not argue, did not try to convince me. He simply stepped back, giving me space I did not expect, which somehow made it worse, because it meant he was not desperate. He was patient, and patient men were dangerous. "It is practical," he replied, like we were discussing a business deal instead of my life. And the rain kept falling, soaking through my jacket, running down my spine, making everything feel colder, sharper, more real. And I looked down at the card again. Adrian Vance printed in clean, expensive lettering. No title, no explanation, just a name that felt heavier the longer I held it. And I should have thrown it away. I should have walked in the opposite direction and never looked back. But instead I slipped it into my pocket, just for a second, just to think. That is what I told myself. And when I looked up again, he was already opening the passenger door of the car, not asking, not insisting, just waiting, like the decision had already been made, and I was catching up again. And I stood there, frozen, between two versions of my life, one where I kept struggling, and one where I stepped into something I did not understand. And the worst part was I knew exactly which one I was about to choose. Because survival does not wait for certainty. It takes whatever is offered. And I moved, slow at first, then faster, before I could stop myself, before I could change my mind. And I slid into the seat, the leather cold against my skin, the door closing with a soft, final sound that echoed louder than it should. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the engine humming quietly as the car pulled away from the curb, the city blurring past the window like it was already leaving me behind. And I stared straight ahead, refusing to look at him, refusing to acknowledge what I had just done. But I could feel him there, his presence steady, controlled, like everything around him adjusted to fit his pace. And after a few seconds he spoke, not looking at me, his eyes on the road. "You made the right choice." And something in me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to push words out of my mouth before I could stop them. "You do not know that," I said. And he glanced at me then. Just once, a brief flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "I do," he replied, simply, and that was worse, because he believed it, completely. And I turned away, focusing on the rain streaking down the glass, counting the seconds between streetlights, anything to keep my thoughts from spiraling. But they did anyway, racing through questions I could not answer. What kind of man makes an offer like that? What kind of life requires a 90-day marriage? And what happens when those 90 days are over? And I did not realize I had asked the last one out loud until he answered, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. "You leave," he said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. And I let out a breath I did not know I was holding. But it did not ease anything, because simple answers rarely meant simple outcomes. And the car slowed, turning onto a long, tree-lined road that did not look like it belonged to the same city I had just left. the buildings fading into something quieter, more controlled, and when the gates appeared ahead, tall, iron, opening without a sound as we approached, my chest tightened, because this was not just a house. This was a boundary, a world that operated by different rules, and I almost told him to stop, almost asked him to turn around, but the car kept moving, and so did I, deeper into something I could not name. And when we finally pulled to a stop, I did not move right away, my hand resting on the door handle, my heart beating faster than it should, and he noticed. Of course he noticed, because he notices everything. "You can still walk away," he said, and for a second, just a second, I believed him. I believed I could open the door, step out, and leave this place behind. But then I thought about the sidewalk, the rain, the empty future waiting for me, and I knew I would not. So instead I opened the door and stepped out. The air cooler here, quieter, like even the world respected the space he occupied, and I followed him inside, through doors that closed just as softly as the car had, sealing something behind me I could not go back to. And the interior was exactly what I expected and nothing like it at the same time. Polished floors, soft lighting, everything in its place, controlled, deliberate, and I stood there, suddenly aware of how out of place I looked. Damp, exhausted, carrying a life that no longer fit me. And he turned to face me fully for the first time, his expression unreadable, his voice steady. 90 days, he said again, like it was a promise, or a warning, or both. You follow my rules, you play your role, and at the end of it, you walk away. Clean, and I nodded, because that was the deal, that was the only thing I could hold on to, even if it felt thinner than it should. And then he added, just as I started to breathe again, "But once you step further in, there is no halfway." And something in his tone made my stomach drop, not fear, not exactly, but the understanding that this was not just about survival anymore. This was about control, and I had just handed mine over without realizing how much it would cost. And as I stood there, in a house that did not feel like mine, in a life that did not belong to me yet, one thought settled quietly in the back of my mind, more dangerous than anything he had said. I had not just agreed to stay for 90 days, I had agreed to become something I did not understand, and I did not know yet if I would recognize myself when it was over. I did not sleep that night, not really, because sleep requires safety, and this place felt like the opposite of that. Not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it was too quiet, too controlled, like every sound had permission before it existed, and I lay in a bed that was softer than anything I had ever owned, staring at a ceiling that looked untouched by time, trying to convince myself that this was temporary, that 90 days was just a number, something I could count down and survive. But numbers lose meaning when you do not know what happens in between. And sometime before dawn, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew there was a knock on the door, precise, measured, not loud but impossible to ignore, and I sat up instantly, my body reacting before my mind caught up, the unfamiliar room pressing in around me as reality settled back into place. And for a second I forgot where I was, until I saw the dress laid out across the chair, elegant, simple, not mine. Nothing here was mine, and that thought grounded me faster than anything else. "Come in," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, and the door opened to reveal a woman I had not seen before, older, composed, her posture straight, her expression calm in a way that felt practiced, like she had seen everything and chosen to react to none of it. "Good morning, Miss Carter," she said, her tone polite but distant, like she was acknowledging a role, not a person, and I frowned slightly at the name, because hearing it here sounded wrong, like it did not belong in this house. "Just Lena," I replied, and she gave a small nod that did not quite reach agreement, more like acknowledgement of something temporary. "Mr. Vance prefers formal introductions," she said, and that should not have mattered, but it did, because it was the first time I heard his name attached to preference, to control, and it made something in my chest tighten. "Of course he does," I muttered, more to myself than to her, and she stepped further into the room, her eyes briefly scanning everything like she was confirming nothing had changed. "You have 30 minutes, she continued, gesturing toward the dress. "Breakfast will be served at 8. And then she turned to leave, efficient, precise, as if her part in this moment was already complete. But before she reached the door I spoke again, the question slipping out before I could stop it. What happens if I do not go? And she paused, just slightly, not turning around immediately, which somehow made the silence heavier. And when she did look back at me, her expression was still calm, still composed. But there was something else there now, something quieter, almost sympathetic. Then you will still be expected, she said simply. And that was the answer. Not an explanation, not a threat, just a fact. And she left, the door closing behind her with the same soft finality everything in this place seemed to carry. And I sat there for a moment, staring at the dress like it might tell me something I needed to know, but it did not. It just waited, like everything else here. And eventually I stood, moving toward it slowly, my fingers brushing the fabric, smooth, expensive, chosen for me. And I wondered how many decisions had already been made without me even noticing. How many choices had been removed before I realized they existed. And that thought stayed with me as I got ready, as I stepped into something that fit perfectly without asking who I was. And when I finally left the room, the hallway was already waiting, quiet, endless, guiding me in a direction I did not choose, but somehow followed anyway. And by the time I reached the dining room, he was already there. Of course he was, standing near the window, his back to me, the morning light catching on the edges of his silhouette in a way that made him look untouchable, like part of the space itself rather than someone inside it. And for a second I hesitated in the doorway, not because I was afraid, not exactly, but because stepping forward felt like crossing another line I could not uncross. And then he spoke without turning around. You are late. And I almost laughed because I was not by any normal standard. But this was not a normal place, and he was not a normal man. So I stepped inside, closing the distance between us with measured steps, refusing to rush, refusing to let him see any hesitation I still carried. It has been less than 30 minutes, I replied, keeping my voice even, and he turned then. Slowly, his eyes meeting mine with that same steady intensity that made it feel like he was always seeing more than I allowed. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to become something else, something intentional. And then he nodded once, like I had passed a test I did not know I was taking. Sit, he said. And it was not a suggestion, but I sat anyway, because this was the role I had agreed to play. And as I did, I noticed the table, set perfectly, everything in its place, nothing out of line, and I realized this was not just breakfast. This was structure, routine, control disguised as normalcy. And he took his seat across from me, his movements calm, deliberate, like nothing in his world ever required adjustment. And for a moment I watched him, trying to understand the man behind the offer, behind the rules, behind the quiet certainty that seemed to follow him everywhere. And I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else so far. He was not trying to intimidate me. He did not need to, because everything around him already did that for him. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost conversational. It still carried that same weight. We will begin today, he said, and I frowned slightly, because begin implied something more than what I had expected, something structured, planned, inevitable. Begin what? I asked, even though part of me already knew the answer, and his gaze did not waver as he replied, your role. And there it was again, that word, role, like this was a performance I had been cast in without an audition, and I felt my chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that this was not just about surviving 90 days. This was about becoming something he had already defined. And as I sat there, across from a man who spoke like everything had already been decided, one thought settled quietly into place, more dangerous than anything else I had felt so far. I was not just learning his world, I was being shaped by it, one rule at a time. There are only 3 rules, he said, and something about the way he spoke made it clear they were not suggestions, not flexible, not open to interpretation, and I straightened slightly in my chair without meaning to, my attention locking onto his words because in a place like this, rules were not guidelines. They were boundaries you did not see until you crossed them. And he noticed that too, of course he did, his gaze steady, assessing, like he was measuring how much I understood already. You do not leave this property without my permission, he continued, his voice even, controlled, like he was listing something routine, and my fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table because that was not unexpected, but hearing it said out loud made it real in a way I could not ignore. And I nodded once, slow, deliberate, refusing to show how much that one sentence shifted the ground under me. And he continued without pause. You do not speak about me, my business, or anything you see here to anyone. And that one felt heavier, not because I planned to, but because it implied there was more here than I had seen, more than I would understand. And that thought settled somewhere in the back of my mind, quiet but persistent. And then he said the last one. And this time his tone changed, just slightly, enough that I felt it before I understood it. And you do not lie to me. And I looked up at him then, fully, because something about that rule felt different from the others, less about control, more about expectation, and that made it more dangerous, because expectations create consequences, even when they are not spoken. And for a moment the silence between us stretched, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, like he was giving me space to react, to question, to push back if I was going to. And part of me wanted to challenge him, to remind him that this was a contract, not ownership. But another part of me understood something important in that moment. Pushing back would not change the rules, it would only change how he responded to me. And I was not ready to find out what that looked like yet, so instead I leaned back slightly, meeting his gaze without lowering mine. And what do I get in return? I asked, keeping my voice calm, measured, even though my pulse had picked up just enough to remind me that this was not a normal conversation. And something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not irritation, something quieter, like approval that I had asked the question at all. You get exactly what I promised, he replied, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no room for doubt, just certainty, and that should have reassured me. But it did not, because certainty from a man like him did not mean safety. It meant control, and I held his gaze for a second longer before nodding once, because for now, that was enough, or at least it had to be, and he seemed to accept that. The tension in the room easing just slightly, though it never disappeared completely, because I was starting to realize that tension was part of this place, part of him. And then he stood, the movement smooth, deliberate, and I followed a second later, not because he told me to, but because I understood the rhythm of this interaction already, and he gestured toward the hallway. You will be prepared for tonight, he said, and I frowned slightly, because tonight implied something I had not been told about. Something I had not agreed to, and I stepped forward, falling into place beside him as we walked, the sound of our footsteps quiet against the polished floor. Prepared for what? I asked, and he did not look at me this time. His gaze forward, focused, like whatever he was thinking about was already in motion. A dinner, he said simply, and I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding, but it did not settle anything, because a dinner in his world did not sound like something simple. And he continued, you will meet people who will expect you to be exactly who I say you are. And there it was again. The role, the expectation, the shape I was supposed to fit into, and my stomach tightened slightly as the weight of that settled in. And who is that? I asked, quieter this time, not because I was unsure, but because the answer felt like it mattered more than anything else he had said so far. And this time he did look at me, his eyes steady, unreadable, but there was something else there now. Something that felt almost intentional, like he wanted me to understand the significance of what he was about to say. My wife, he said, and the word landed heavier than it should. Heavier than any of the rules, heavier than the contract itself, because it was not just a title, it was a position, a perception, something that would define how everyone else saw me. And for a moment I could not speak, because hearing it out loud made everything real in a way it had not been before. And he watched me, not impatient, not concerned, just waiting, like he expected me to process it and move forward. And after a second I did, because that was what this was, moving forward whether I was ready or not. And I nodded once, slower this time, more deliberate, because this was not just agreement. This was acceptance, at least on the surface. And we stopped at the end of the hallway, another door, another threshold, and he reached for the handle, pausing just long enough to look at me again, his voice lower now, almost quiet, but no less certain. Do not disappoint me, he said, and it was not a threat, not exactly, but it did not need to be, because something in the way he said it made it clear that disappointment here was not something you wanted to define for yourself. And before I could respond, before I could ask what that meant, the door opened, and I stepped forward, into the next part of a life I was still trying to understand, with one thought echoing quietly in the back of my mind. This was not just about pretending anymore. This was about becoming convincing enough that no one would question it, including him. The room on the other side of that door did not feel like a place you walked into. It felt like a place you were measured in. And the moment I stepped inside, I understood why, because everything about it was intentional, from the soft lighting that made every surface glow just enough to feel expensive, to the quiet presence of people who did not look at me directly, but somehow still saw everything. And I slowed without meaning to. My steps more careful now, my awareness sharper, because this was not just another room. This was a stage, and I had just been pushed into the center of it without rehearsal. And the woman from earlier was already there, waiting, as if she had anticipated the exact second I would arrive. Her expression calm, unchanged, but her eyes sharper now, assessing in a way that felt different from before, more focused, more precise, like she was not just observing me, she was preparing me. "We have limited time," she said, her voice steady, efficient, and I almost laughed at that, because everything here seemed to operate on time I did not control, and I nodded once, because what else was I supposed to do? And she moved closer, circling me slowly, not touching, just observing, like I was something that needed to be adjusted rather than understood. "Stand straight," she added, and I did, my shoulders pulling back automatically, because there was something about her tone that made it easier to follow than resist, and she stopped in front of me, her gaze steady. "Tonight, you are not uncertain," she said, and I blinked slightly, because that was not a physical instruction. That was something else entirely, something harder to perform. "I am not uncertain," I repeated, more to test the words than believe them, and she gave a small nod, like that was acceptable for now, and then she stepped back, gesturing toward a rack of dresses I had not noticed when I first walked in, each one more precise than the last, not louder, not more extravagant, just chosen with a kind of quiet authority that made it clear they were meant to be seen without asking for attention, and she selected one without hesitation, a deep color that caught the light in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and handed it to me like it was not optional. "This," she said simply, and I took it, because at this point, refusal felt less like control and more like disruption, and disruption here did not seem like something that ended well. And as I changed, I could feel her presence just outside the room, not intrusive, not impatient, just there, constant, like everything else in this place. And when I stepped back out, she adjusted the fabric with careful precision, smoothing edges that did not need smoothing, aligning details I had not noticed, until finally she stepped back again, her eyes scanning me one last time before she nodded, satisfied. "Now you look like you belong," she said, and something about that sentence sat wrong with me, not because I disagreed, but because I did not know what belonging meant here, and before I could ask, before I could question anything, the door opened again, and he stepped in, Adrian, his presence shifting the air in the room the same way it had the night before, not louder, not heavier, just different, like everything recalibrated around him without effort. And he stopped a few feet away, his gaze settling on me, not quickly, not casually, but with a kind of focus that made it feel like he was reading something written beneath the surface. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to become something else, something charged. And then he nodded once, a small movement, but it carried weight, approval. Without exaggeration, and I exhaled slowly, not because I needed his approval, but because part of me had been waiting for it without realizing it. And that unsettled me more than anything else. "Good," he said, his voice low, controlled, and I straightened slightly, not because he told me to, but because the word felt like a signal, like something had just been confirmed, and he stepped closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough to shift the distance between us, and his gaze flickered, briefly to the details of the dress, the way it fit, the way it moved, before returning to my face, and for a second I thought he might say something else, something more, but instead he turned slightly, gesturing toward the door. "It is time," he said, and that was it, no explanation, no reassurance, just a transition into whatever came next, and I followed him, because that was what I had agreed to do. And as we walked through the hallway again, everything felt different now, not because the space had changed, but because I had, just enough to notice the shift, just enough to understand that this was no longer about adjusting. It was about performing. And when we reached the entrance, the doors already open, the evening air cooler, sharper, carrying the quiet hum of something waiting just beyond sight. I paused for half a second, not long enough to stop, just long enough to feel the weight of the moment settle into place. And he noticed, of course he noticed, his voice low beside me, almost quiet. "Stay close," he said. And it was not a command, not exactly, but it did not need to be, because I understood what it meant, not just physically, but everything else that came with it. And I stepped forward, matching his pace as we moved toward the waiting car. The same one from the night before, its presence steady, unchanged, like everything else connected to him. And as the door opened and I stepped inside, I caught my reflection in the glass for just a second, and I almost did not recognize the person looking back at me, not because she was different, but because she looked like she belonged somewhere I did not understand. And as the door closed, sealing me into this next part of the night, one thought settled quietly in my mind, clearer than anything else so far. This was no longer about pretending to be his wife. This was about convincing the world that I already was. The city looked different at night from inside his world. Not louder, not brighter, just more controlled. Like every light we passed had a purpose I could not see. And I sat in the back seat of the car with my hands resting still in my lap, forcing myself not to fidget, not to give away how aware I was of everything. The movement, the silence, him beside me, steady, composed, like this was just another evening. And I wondered how many nights like this he had lived through without thinking about it. How many times he had walked into rooms where everyone already knew who he was. And then I realized something that made my chest tighten slightly. Tonight, they would be looking at me too, not as myself, but as something connected to him, something defined by his presence. And that thought settled quietly but heavily, because it meant I was about to be seen in a way I could not control. And the car slowed, turning into a long drive lined with soft lights that did not glare, just guided, leading toward a building that did not try to impress and did not need to, because everything about it already said enough. And as we came to a stop, I felt it again, that pause before something begins, that moment where you could still step back if you wanted to, but I did not move, because I already knew I would not. And the door opened, and cool air brushed against my skin as I stepped out. The sound of distant conversation carrying through the entrance, low, measured, like even the voices here knew how to behave, and I glanced at him for just a second, not long enough to draw attention, just enough to confirm he was still exactly the same, unaffected, certain, and he met my gaze briefly, his voice low, almost quiet. "Remember who you are tonight," he said, and I held his eyes for a second longer than I should have, because that question sat differently now, not just about a role, but about identity, about how much of myself I was willing to set aside to become what he needed. And I nodded once, because words felt unnecessary, and we moved forward together, the doors opening before us without effort, and the shift was immediate, not in sound, not in light, but in attention, because even if no one turned right away, I could feel it, the awareness, the subtle change in the room as we entered, like a ripple moving outward that no one acknowledged but everyone noticed. And I kept my posture steady, my pace even, remembering what the woman had said. "You are not uncertain," and I repeated it silently, grounding myself in something that felt just stable enough to hold on to. And as we moved deeper into the room, I began to see it clearly, the way people positioned themselves, the way conversations adjusted slightly as we passed, not stopping, not staring, just shifting, like the presence beside me altered the balance without needing to announce it. And then someone approached, a man with a smile that looked practiced but not false. His attention focused entirely on Adrian at first. "Vance," he said, his tone familiar but careful, and Adrian nodded slightly, acknowledging without engaging too much. And then the man's gaze shifted to me, not curious, not dismissive, just evaluating, like he was placing me into a context he had not expected. And for a second I felt it, the weight of that look, the question behind it, and I answered without speaking, lifting my chin just slightly, holding his gaze for exactly as long as I needed to before letting it go, not too fast, not too slow, and something in his expression adjusted, just enough to tell me I had done it right. "And this is," he began, leaving space for introduction, for explanation, for something I was not sure I was ready to say, but Adrian did not hesitate, did not look at me for confirmation. My wife, he said. The words smooth, certain, like they had always been true, and the air shifted again, not dramatically, just enough to mark the change, and the man's expression settled into something more respectful, more aware, like that one word had recalibrated everything he thought he knew. And I felt it too, not just in how he looked at me, but in how I held myself, because hearing it here, in front of people who mattered to him, made it real in a way it had not been before, and I offered a small nod. Controlled, composed, matching the tone of the room, and the conversation moved on, not lingering, not questioning, just accepting, because that was how this world worked. Things were not challenged unless necessary, and we continued through the space, stopping occasionally, exchanging brief words, introductions that felt more like acknowledgments, each one reinforcing the same idea, the same role, until it began to feel less like something I was pretending and more like something I was stepping into. And that realization unsettled me more than anything else so far, because it meant I was adapting faster than I expected, and somewhere in the middle of it all, as another conversation ended and we stepped aside for a moment, I felt his presence shift slightly beside me, not moving closer, not touching, just there, steady, and he spoke quietly, just for me. You are doing well, and the words were simple, but they landed differently than before, not just approval, but recognition. And I glanced at him briefly, my voice just as quiet. I am following the rules, I said, and something in his expression changed, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice. But I saw it, the faintest hint of something that was not control, not expectation, something else, something I could not name yet. No, he replied softly. You are understanding them. And that was different, because understanding meant choice, meant awareness, meant I was not just reacting anymore, I was learning. And that thought stayed with me as the night continued, as I moved through conversations that were not mine, in a role I had not chosen, beside a man who did not ask. And by the time we stepped back into the quiet of the night outside, the air cooler, the city distant again, one thing had become clear in a way I could not ignore. I had not just survived the first test, I had passed it, and that was far more dangerous than failing would have been. Do not get comfortable, he said as the car door closed behind us, and I felt that sentence settle into me before I even understood why, because comfort had not been part of anything since the moment I stepped into his world, and yet something about tonight had shifted just enough to make it dangerous, and I turned my head slightly to look at him, the city lights moving across his face in quiet patterns as we drove, his expression unchanged, controlled, like whatever he had seen tonight had confirmed something he already knew. And I realized then that this was not just an observation, it was a warning, and I let out a slow breath, my fingers resting still against my lap as I replayed the evening in my mind. Every look, every word, every pause measured and remembered, because in a place like that, nothing was accidental, and I knew he was doing the same, analyzing, calculating, deciding what it all meant. And after a moment I spoke, my voice steady but quieter than before. I was not trying to be comfortable. And he glanced at me then, just briefly, but long enough that I felt it, that same awareness, like he was looking for something beneath the surface, and he nodded once, not disagreeing, not agreeing either, just acknowledging. That is why it worked, he said, and that answer stayed with me longer than it should have, because it meant the balance I had found tonight was not about fitting in. It was about not belonging too easily, about holding on to something that was still mine, even while everything else adjusted around me. And I turned back toward the window, watching the city blur past again, but it did not feel the same as before, because now I knew what it looked like from the inside, and that knowledge changed the way I saw everything. And the car slowed as we approached the gates, the familiar quiet settling around us again as they opened without sound. And for a second I hesitated, not physically, but internally, because stepping back into the house felt different now, like I was returning to something instead of entering it for the first time. And that thought unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant this place was already starting to feel less foreign, and that was exactly what I needed to avoid. And when we stepped inside, the silence wrapped around us again, controlled, constant, and I moved through it with a little more certainty than before, my steps quieter, more deliberate, not because I was trying to imitate him, but because I was starting to understand the rhythm of this place, and that realization made me slow slightly, just enough to notice it. And he noticed too. Of course he did. "You are adapting quickly," he said, his voice calm, not accusing, not impressed, just stating something that felt more like a fact than a compliment. And I stopped walking, turning to face him fully this time, because something about that sentence made it impossible not to respond. "I do not know if that is a good thing," I said, and for the first time since I met him, there was a pause, not long, not dramatic, just enough to exist. And his gaze held mine a second longer than usual, like he was considering the answer instead of already knowing it. And that was new, and I felt it immediately. That shift, small but undeniable. And then he spoke, quieter now. "That depends on what you think you are becoming." And the words landed heavier than anything else he had said tonight, because they were not about rules, not about roles. They were about identity, about something deeper than performance. And I held his gaze, refusing to look away, because this felt like a moment that mattered, even if I did not understand why yet. "I am not becoming anything," I replied, more firmly than I felt, because the alternative was something I was not ready to face, and something in his expression changed again, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to see, but I saw it, that faint shift, like he recognized the difference between what I said and what I believed. And instead of arguing, instead of correcting me, he simply nodded. "Then hold on to that," he said, and the simplicity of it made it more complicated, because holding on to something implies there is a risk of losing it. And that thought followed me as I turned away, continuing down the hallway toward my room, the sound of my footsteps. Quieter now, more controlled, and when I reached the door, I paused, my hand resting against the handle for a second longer than necessary, because I could feel it, that shift again, that subtle change in how this space felt around me. And I did not like it, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it was not, and I pushed the door open, stepping inside, the room exactly as I had left it, unchanged, waiting, and I closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing slightly in the quiet, and for a moment I just stood there, staring at nothing in particular, letting the silence settle, letting my thoughts catch up to everything that had happened, and they came all at once, not chaotic, not overwhelming, just clear in a way that made them harder to ignore, the way people had looked at me, the way they had accepted me without question, the way I had responded without hesitation. And I crossed the room slowly, stopping in front of the mirror without meaning to, my reflection staring back at me with a composure I did not recognize, not because it was fake, but because it felt practiced, like something I had already started to learn. And I lifted my hand slightly, touching the edge of the fabric I was still wearing, the dress that was never mine, but somehow fit perfectly. And I let out a slow breath, my voice barely above a whisper even though no one else was there to hear it. "This is temporary," I said, and the words sounded right. They made sense, they were true, but something in the way they echoed back at me felt different now, less certain, and I lowered my hand, stepping back from the mirror as if distance would make it clearer, but it did not, because the truth was already there, quiet and steady beneath everything else. I had not just stepped into his world, I had started to understand it, and that was the moment I realized the most dangerous part of all of this was not him. It was how easily I was learning to exist beside him. I woke up before the house did, and that was the first thing that felt wrong, because this place did not sleep. It paused, it waited, it held itself in a kind of quiet control that never truly disappeared. And yet when I opened my eyes, the silence felt different, thinner somehow, like something had shifted while I was not paying attention. And I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to place it, trying to understand why my chest felt tighter than usual. But there was nothing obvious, no sound, no movement, just that same stillness, and I pushed the feeling aside, because uncertainty here was a liability, and I was learning that faster than I wanted to admit. So I got up, moving through the room with the same careful awareness I had started to adopt, not because I was trying to belong, but because this place required precision, even in the smallest things. And when I opened the door, the hallway greeted me the same way it always did, quiet, composed. But today there was something else beneath it, something I could not see but could feel, like the air itself was paying closer attention. And I stepped forward anyway, my pace steady, my expression neutral, because whatever had changed, I was not going to be the one who reacted first, and as I moved down the hall, I noticed it in the smallest details. A door slightly more closed than before, footsteps further away than usual, voices lower, more controlled, and I realized then that this house was not just a place, it was a system, and systems respond to things, even when you do not understand what those things are. And that thought stayed with me as I reached the main floor, the familiar layout offering no answers, only the same controlled environment I had started to recognize, and I turned toward the dining room out of habit more than intention, but when I stepped inside, he was already there. Of course he was, standing near the window again, the morning light outlining him in the same quiet way, but something about his posture was different today, not tense, not relaxed, just more focused, like whatever was on his mind had already been decided, and I stopped just inside the doorway, watching him for a second longer than I should have, because I could feel it now, that shift, clearer than before, and without turning, he spoke. "You are early." And I almost smiled at that, because it was not a question, not even an observation, just another piece of information placed exactly where it belonged, and I stepped further into the room, my voice calm, steady. "So are you." And he turned then, slowly, his gaze finding mine with that same intensity that never seemed to change, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to become something deliberate, something that felt like it was testing the space between us, and then he nodded once, like that was enough, like whatever he had been considering had just been confirmed, and he gestured toward the table, "Sit." And I did, because this part had already become familiar, the structure, the rhythm, the unspoken understanding of how things moved here, and as I settled into the chair, I noticed the difference immediately. The table set the same, the room unchanged, but the atmosphere tighter, more controlled, like something beneath the surface had shifted just enough to be felt, but not explained. And I looked at him again, studying the way he moved, the way he carried himself, searching for something that might tell me what had changed, but he gave nothing away, not in his posture, not in his expression, just that same steady control that made it impossible to read him unless he wanted to be read. And that realization made me lean back slightly, my voice quieter now, more careful. "Something is different," I said, and it was not a question, not really, more like an acknowledgement of what I already felt, and for the first time since I met him. He did not answer immediately, the pause stretching just enough to make it noticeable, and when he did speak, his tone was lower, more deliberate. "You are paying attention," he said, and that was not an answer, not directly, but it told me enough, because it meant I was not imagining it, and I held his gaze, refusing to let the moment pass too easily. "What changed?" I asked, and this time his eyes did not shift, did not soften. They stayed exactly where they were, steady, controlled, and something else beneath that, something sharper, something I had not seen before. "You," he said, and the word landed heavier than I expected, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple, direct, and for a second I did not understand it, my mind trying to place it into something that made sense. "Me," I repeated, quieter now, and he nodded once, like that was all the confirmation I was going to get. People respond to what they see. He continued, his voice even, measured. "Last night, they saw you, and I felt that again, that shift, that realization settling deeper than before, because he was not talking about appearance, not about the dress or the role. He was talking about something else, something I had not fully understood yet, and I straightened slightly, my hands still against the table, grounding myself in something steady as my thoughts moved faster than I wanted. "And what did they see?" I asked, and this time there was no pause, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that made the answer feel inevitable. "Someone who belongs," he said, and the words should have reassured me, should have meant I was doing what I was supposed to do, but instead they unsettled me more than anything else he had said so far, because belonging here was not something I had agreed to. It was something that was happening anyway, and I held his gaze, my voice steady even as something deeper shifted beneath it. "That was the point," I said, and something changed in his expression then, not visible, not obvious, but I saw it, that faint recognition, like he understood the difference between what I said and what I meant, and instead of correcting me, instead of pushing further, he leaned back slightly, his gaze still on mine. "Be careful," he said, and the simplicity, of it made it more serious, more real. Because warnings here were never exaggerated, they were precise, and I felt it settle into me. That quiet understanding that whatever this was, whatever I was becoming, it was not just about survival anymore. It was about something else entirely, something I could not define yet. And as the silence returned, heavier now, more deliberate, one thought moved through my mind with a clarity I could not ignore. I had not just stepped into his world, I had started to change how that world saw me. And that was a line I did not know how to step back from. "You are starting to forget the difference," he said, and I felt those words before I understood them, because forgetting implies something was once clear, and I did not like the idea. That clarity was already slipping away, and I held his gaze across the table, refusing to react too quickly, because reacting too quickly here always meant giving something away, and I was learning that silence could be more powerful than any answer. But this time silence did not feel like control, it felt like hesitation, and that unsettled me more than anything else. "The difference between what?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, even though something in my chest had tightened just enough to make breathing feel more deliberate. And he did not look away, did not soften, his expression exactly as it had been since the moment I met him, controlled, precise, unreadable unless he wanted it to be. "Between playing a role," he said slowly, each word measured, "and becoming it." And there it was, the line I had been avoiding without realizing it, the one I had told myself I would never cross. And I leaned back slightly, my fingers tightening against the edge of the table before I forced them to relax, because showing tension here felt like losing ground I had not meant to give up. "I am not becoming anything," I said again, the same words as before, but this time they felt thinner, less certain, and I knew he heard that difference, because his gaze did not change, but something beneath it sharpened, like he was seeing past the words and into what I was trying not to admit. And for a moment the silence stretched between us, heavier now, not just a pause, but a space filled with something unspoken, something neither of us was willing to name yet. And then he stood, the movement smooth, controlled, like everything he did, and I watched him, my attention following without permission, because part of me had already started to anticipate his actions before he made them. And that realization hit me harder than anything he had said, because it meant I was adjusting not just in behavior, but in awareness. And I did not like how natural it felt. "Come with me," he said, not looking back to see if I would follow, because he already knew I would, and I hesitated for half a second, just enough to remind myself that I still had a choice, even if it did not feel like one. And then I stood, stepping into place beside him as we moved through the hallway, the same quiet, controlled environment wrapping around us again, but this time it felt different, not unfamiliar, not distant, just known in a way that made it harder to keep myself separate from it. And we stopped in front of a door I had not seen before, or maybe I had and just had not noticed, which felt more likely, because this house seemed designed to reveal itself only when necessary. And he opened it without explanation, stepping aside just enough for me to enter first, and I did, because at this point, curiosity had started to outweigh hesitation, and the room inside was nothing like the rest of the house, not in design, not in structure, but in feeling, because it was not controlled in the same way. It was personal, deliberate, filled with things that were not just placed but chosen, and I slowed as I stepped further in, my eyes moving over the details without meaning to. Books, objects, pieces that did not exist for appearance but for purpose, and I realized then that this was not part of the performance. This was something else entirely, and I turned slightly, my voice quieter now, more careful. "What is this?" I asked, and he stepped inside behind me, the door closing softly as it always did, sealing us into a space that felt different from everything else I had seen so far. And he did not answer right away, which told me this mattered, because he only paused when something was intentional. "This is where I think," he said. Finally, and I blinked slightly, because that was not the answer I expected, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple in a way that revealed more than it hid. And I looked around again, this time with a different understanding, seeing the room not as part of his world, but as part of him. And that changed everything, because it meant I was no longer just being shown what he wanted others to see. I was being shown something real, something unfiltered, and that realization made my chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the awareness that this was a line I had not expected to cross, and I turned back to him, my voice steady but quieter than before. "Why am I here?" I asked, and this time he did not look away, did not soften, but there was something different in his gaze now, something less controlled, less distant, like he had chosen to let part of that control go, just slightly, just enough to matter. "Because you need to understand something," he said, and the weight of those words settled into the room, into me, into the space between us, and I felt it immediately, that shift, that moment where things move from surface to something deeper, something harder to step away from, and I held his gaze, waiting, because I knew better than to interrupt, and he stepped closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough to make the distance between us feel intentional. "This world," he continued, his voice lower now, more deliberate, "does not change for people," and I felt that settle, not as information, but as truth, something I had already started to understand without wanting to admit it. And he watched me as he spoke, not just talking, but observing, measuring how much I was taking in, how much I was willing to accept. "People change for it," he finished, and the silence that followed was different from before, not empty, not controlled, but full of something I could not ignore, something that made it impossible to pretend this was still just a contract, still just 90 days, because that sentence changed the structure of everything, and I stood there, in a room that was more him than anything else I had seen, feeling something shift inside me that I could not stop, could not control, and for the first time since I met him, I did not have an answer ready, did not have a response that felt strong enough to hold on to. And that was when I realized the most dangerous part of all of this was not that he was trying to change me. It was that I was starting to understand why people let him. "Then leave," he said, and the words did not sound like a challenge, not like a threat, just an option placed between us with the same calm precision as everything else he did. And that made it worse, because options imply freedom, and I was starting to understand that freedom here was never as simple as it sounded, and I stood there in that room, surrounded by pieces of a man I was only beginning to understand, feeling something shift inside me that I could not name, because part of me wanted to take that option, wanted to walk out, to remind myself that this was temporary, that I was still in control, but another part of me stayed exactly where I was, unmoving, because leaving would mean stepping back into a world that no longer felt the same, and I hated that realization more than anything else, and I let out a slow breath, my voice quieter now, more honest. "Than I intended, that is not really an option," I said, and for a moment he did not respond, his gaze steady, searching, like he was measuring the difference between what I said and what I believed, and then he stepped closer, not abruptly, not forcefully, just enough to shift the space between us again. "It always is," he replied, and the certainty in his voice made it clear that he believed it, completely. And that was what unsettled me the most. Not that he controlled everything, but that he did not think he needed to. And I looked at him, really looked this time, past the control, past the composure, searching for something that explained it. And I realized then that this was not about power the way I had imagined it. Not loud, not aggressive, just absolute in a way that did not require effort. And that understanding made my chest tighten slightly, because it meant this was not something I could resist in the ways I was used to. And I turned away, my gaze falling back to the room, to the things that made up pieces of him, trying to ground myself in something that was not him, something that was still separate, but even that felt harder now, because everything here was connected to him in ways I was only beginning to see. And I took a step back, creating distance, even if it was small, even if it did not change anything. And I spoke again, more controlled this time. "You said 90 days. I reminded him, and he nodded once, like that fact had never been in question. "I did," he said, and I held on to that, because it was one of the few things that still felt defined, still felt like something I could rely on. "Then that is all this is," I continued, my voice steady, more certain now, because I needed it to be, a role, a contract, nothing more. And the words hung between us, clear, deliberate, and for a second I thought he might challenge it, might push back, might break down the logic the way he seemed capable of breaking down everything else. But he did not. He just watched me, his expression unreadable, and then he nodded, once, slow, like he was accepting the terms of something I did not fully understand. If that is what you need it to be, he said. And that answer should have reassured me, should have confirmed that I still had control over this, that I could define the boundaries. But instead it unsettled me more, because it sounded less like agreement and more like patience, like he was waiting for something to change without needing to force it. And that thought stayed with me as I turned toward the door, because suddenly the room felt too small, too aware, like everything in it had seen more than I intended to reveal, and I needed space, distance, something that reminded me I was still separate from all of this. And I reached for the handle, my fingers brushing the cool surface just as his voice stopped me again, quieter this time, but no less certain. You are already changing, he said, and I froze, not because I wanted to, but because something in the way he said it made it impossible not to, and I did not turn around immediately, because I was not sure I wanted to see the look on his face when he said it, not sure I wanted confirmation of something I was trying to deny, and for a moment the silence stretched, heavy, deliberate, and then I turned, slowly, meeting his gaze again, because avoiding it would not make it less true, and I shook my head slightly, more instinct than logic. No, I said, and my voice was steady, but something beneath it was not, and I knew he heard that too, because he always did, and he did not argue, did not correct me, he just held my gaze, letting the silence do what words did not need to, and that was worse, because silence leaves room for truth to settle in ways you cannot control, and I looked away first, not because I lost, not because I agreed, but because I needed to breathe, needed to create space between his certainty and my own thoughts, and I opened the door, stepping out into the hallway, the familiar quiet wrapping around me again, but it did not feel the same as before, not neutral, not controlled, just different, like something had shifted that I could not put back, and I moved quickly this time. Not running, not rushing, just not lingering, because staying still felt like thinking too much, and thinking too much felt like seeing things I was not ready to face. And when I reached my room, I closed the door behind me, the soft click louder than it should have been, and I leaned back against it for a second, my eyes closing as I tried to steady my breathing, because something inside me had changed, not dramatically, not visibly, just enough to matter, and I pushed myself away from the door, moving toward the window, needing something external, something real, and I looked out at the city beyond the gates, the lights distant, separate, reminding me that there was still a world outside of this one, still a version of my life that did not revolve around him, and I held on to that, tightly, because I needed it, needed the reminder that this was temporary, that I was still in control, that 90 days was still just a number, and yet, as I stood there, watching a world that already felt further away than it should have, one thought settled quietly into place, more dangerous than anything he had said. It was not that I could not leave, it was that I was starting to understand why I had not yet. You are not afraid of me, he said the next morning, and that was the first thing that felt wrong, because fear would have been easier, cleaner, something I could define and resist, but what I felt was something else entirely, something quieter, more complicated, and I stood in the doorway of the dining room, watching him before stepping inside, because I had started to notice that the way he opened conversations mattered, that nothing he said first was accidental, and I moved forward slowly, my posture steady, my expression neutral, even though my mind was already trying to catch up to what he meant. Should I be? I asked, my voice calm, measured, and he glanced up from the table, his gaze settling on me with that same quiet intensity. And for a second, there was something almost like curiosity there, like he was not asking to confirm something he knew, but to see how I would answer. And that was new, and I felt it immediately, that shift in dynamic, subtle but undeniable. Most people are, he replied, and I considered that for a moment as I took my seat, because most people did not know him the way I was starting to, not the controlled version he showed the world, but the one that existed underneath it, the one that chose silence over explanation, patience over pressure, and I realized then that fear required unpredictability, and there was nothing unpredictable about him. Not really. Everything he did followed a pattern, a logic, even if I did not always understand it, and I leaned back slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I think people are afraid of what they do not understand, I said, and something in his expression shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but I saw it, that faint change, like the answer had landed somewhere he had not expected, and he nodded once, slowly, like he was acknowledging something more than just my words. "And you understand," he said, and it was not a question, but I felt it like one, like he was testing the boundaries of what I believed. And I held his gaze, refusing to look away, because this felt like a moment that mattered. "I am starting to," I admitted, and the honesty in that surprised even me, because I had spent so much time trying to hold on to the idea that this was temporary, that understanding him was not necessary. But that was no longer true, because understanding him had become part of surviving this. And he leaned back slightly, studying me in a way that felt different from before, less about control, more about observation, like he was seeing something change in real time. And after a moment he spoke. Again, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. "That is the problem," he said, and I frowned slightly, because I had expected something else, something that confirmed what I was doing was right, not something that suggested it was not. "Why?" I asked, and this time there was no pause, no hesitation, just a simple answer that carried more weight than anything else he had said so far. "Because understanding leads to attachment," he said, and the words settled between us like something fragile and dangerous at the same time, and I felt it immediately. That shift, that moment where everything I had been avoiding came into focus, not clearly, not completely, but enough to make it impossible to ignore. And I straightened slightly, my fingers resting still against the table, grounding myself in something that felt steady. "This is not about attachment," I said, more firmly than I felt, because the alternative was something I was not ready to face. And he did not argue, did not correct me. He just watched me, his gaze steady, patient, like he was waiting for me to hear my own words the way he did. And the silence stretched, heavier now, more deliberate. And I realized then that this was not a conversation about rules or roles. This was something else. Something deeper, something that did not have clear boundaries. And that unsettled me more than anything else so far, because it meant I was no longer just navigating his world. I was navigating him. And that was far more complicated, and I looked away first, not because I agreed, but because I needed space, needed to think without his presence shaping the way I processed things. And I stood, moving toward the window without asking, because I needed something external, something that reminded me there was still a world outside of this. And as I looked out at the city beyond the gates, the distance felt different now, not unreachable, not impossible, just less relevant. And that realization hit me harder than anything else, because it meant the world I came from was already starting to feel like something separate, something I was observing instead of belonging to. And I turned back slowly, my voice quieter now, more controlled. "You said I could leave," I reminded him, and he nodded. Once, like that had never changed. "You can," he said, and I held on to that, because it was one of the few things that still felt certain, still felt like something I could rely on. "Then nothing here should matter," I continued, and for a moment I believed it, because logic made it simple, clear, contained, but something in his expression shifted again, not enough to define, just enough to feel. "Then why does it?" he asked, and that was it, the question I had been avoiding without realizing it, the one that cut through everything else. And I did not have an answer, not one that felt strong enough to hold on to, and the silence that followed was different from before, not controlled, not deliberate, just real in a way that made it harder to ignore. And I stood there, caught between what I told myself and what I was starting to feel. And for the first time since I met him, I realized something that changed everything. The most dangerous part of all of this was not that he could control me, it was that he did not need to, because I was starting to choose to stay. "You are asking the wrong question," he said, and I felt that before I understood it, because everything I had been holding on to, every boundary I thought I had defined, suddenly felt less solid, like it had been built on something I had not fully seen yet. And I stood there, still facing the window. The city stretched out beyond the glass like a reminder of something I was trying not to lose, and I did not turn right away, because turning meant engaging, meant stepping back into a conversation. I was not sure I was ready to finish, but silence here never stayed neutral for long, and I knew he was watching, not impatient, not forcing, just waiting, like he always did, and that patience was starting to feel more dangerous than anything else. And I exhaled slowly before turning back, meeting his gaze with the same steadiness I had learned to hold, even when everything beneath it felt less certain. Then what is the right question? I asked, and my voice was calm, controlled, but there was something else there now, something sharper, something that came from realizing I was no longer just reacting. I was starting to push back in ways I had not before, and he noticed. Of course he noticed, his expression shifting just slightly, not in a way most people would see, but enough for me to feel it, like the balance between us had adjusted by a fraction, and for a moment he did not answer, his gaze steady, considering. Like the question itself mattered more than the answer. And then he stepped closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough to make the distance between us feel intentional again. You keep asking why you are staying, he said, his voice low, measured. But that is not the part you are avoiding. And I felt that immediately. The way his words moved past the surface of the conversation and into something deeper, something I had not wanted to name, and my fingers tightened slightly at my sides before I forced them to relax, because reacting here always meant revealing more than I intended, and I held his gaze, refusing to let the moment shift too quickly. Then what am I avoiding? I asked, and this time my voice was quieter, not weaker, just more precise, because I understood now that volume meant nothing here. Only clarity did, and he did not hesitate, did not soften, just gave me the answer the same way he gave everything else, direct and unavoidable. What you are becoming, he said, and the words settled into the space between us with a weight that made it impossible to ignore, and for a second everything went still, not the room, not the world, just something inside me, like my mind had paused, trying to process something it had already understood but refused to accept, and I shook my head slightly, more instinct than thought, because denial felt easier than facing something I could not control. I am not becoming anything, I said again, but this time the words felt different, not stronger, not weaker, just less convincing, like they were echoing instead of grounding, and I knew he heard that too, because he always did, and instead of correcting me, instead of pushing further, he stepped back slightly, creating space where there had been none, and that surprised me more than anything else, because it felt like he was giving me room to think instead of forcing me to confront it, and that kind of control was harder to resist than pressure, and I turned away. Again, my gaze falling back to the window, because I needed something external, something that was not shaped by him, not influenced by his presence, and I focused on the city, the movement, the distance, trying to remind myself that there was still a version of my life that existed outside of this, still a place where I was just myself, not someone defined by a role or a contract or a man who seemed to see through everything I tried to hold on to. And I let out a slow breath, my voice quieter now, more honest than I intended. I am just trying to get through this, I said, and the simplicity of it made it feel more real than anything else I had said so far. And for a moment there was no response, no immediate correction, just silence, and then his voice, softer this time, but no, less certain. That stopped being true the moment you started understanding it, he said, and I closed my eyes briefly, because that hit something I could not deflect, could not argue against with logic or distance, because he was right, and I hated that, not because I did not want to understand, but because understanding changed things. It made them harder to ignore, harder to leave behind, and I turned back slowly, my expression controlled even as something deeper shifted beneath it. You think I am choosing this, I said, and it was not an accusation, not exactly, just a question that needed to be answered, and he held my gaze, his expression unchanged, but there was something else there now, something quieter, something that felt almost like acknowledgement. I think you already have, he replied, and that was it, the line I could not step back from, the one that made everything else before it feel smaller, less defined, and I stood there, caught between what I had told myself and what I was starting to see, and for the first time since this began, I realized something that made everything else feel less certain. It was not about whether I could leave, it was about whether I would, and that difference changed everything, because leaving is a decision, and decisions require clarity, and clarity was the one thing I was starting to lose, and as the silence settled around us again, heavier now, more deliberate, one thought moved through my mind with a clarity I could not ignore. I had not just stepped into his world, I had started to choose it in ways I did not fully understand, and that was the moment I realized the most dangerous part of all of this was not that he saw who I was becoming, it was that I was starting to see it too. It is day 90, he said, and the words should have felt like freedom, like the end of something temporary, something controlled, something I had been counting down even when I pretended not to, but instead they landed quietly, almost softly, like a door opening without sound, and I stood there in the center of the room, not moving, because movement would have made it real in a way I was not ready to face. And the silence between us stretched, not tense, not heavy, just present, like everything else that had existed between us over the past days. And I looked at him, really looked this time, not trying to understand, not trying to define, just seeing him as he was, steady, composed, unchanged in all the ways that had once felt overwhelming and now felt familiar. And that was the first thing that felt wrong, because familiarity was not supposed to happen here, not in a place that was meant to be temporary. And I let out a slow breath, my voice quieter than I expected. So, this is it, I said, and he nodded once, like that fact had never been in question. This is it, he repeated, and there was no hesitation, no shift in tone, just the same certainty he had always carried. And I waited for something else, for explanation, for instruction, for the next step that would tell me how to move forward, but it did not come, and that was when I understood there was no next step, because this was the end of what we had agreed to, and everything after this was no longer defined, no longer controlled. And that realization settled into me slowly, not as relief, not as fear, just as something I had not prepared for. And I turned slightly, my gaze drifting toward the window, toward the world beyond the gates that had once felt like distance, and now felt like something else entirely, something I could not quite place. And I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing there again, looking out at a city that had not changed, but felt different anyway. And I could feel him behind me, not moving closer, not stepping away, just there, the same way he had always been, steady, present. And I closed my eyes briefly, letting the silence settle, letting the moment exist without trying to shape it into something it was not. And then I spoke, not turning back, because I did not need to see his expression to know he was listening. I thought this would feel different, I said, and my voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something quieter, something that had not been there before, and he did not respond right away, which told me this mattered, because he only waited. When something was intentional, and after a moment his voice came, low, controlled, but softer than I had ever heard it. Different how? He asked, and I opened my eyes, focusing on the lights in the distance, because they were easier to look at than whatever was happening between us. Lighter, I said, and that was the truth, simple and clear in a way that made it harder to ignore, like something ending should feel like relief. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was full of something I could not name, something that made the air feel heavier without changing anything around us. And I turned slowly this time, meeting his gaze again, because avoiding it would not make anything easier. And he was watching me, not analyzing, not measuring, just watching, and that was new, and I felt it immediately, that shift, that difference in how he looked at me, like something had changed without being spoken, and I held his gaze, my voice quieter now, more certain in its uncertainty, but it does not. I finished, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to become something else, something that felt like it was waiting for one of us to define it. And then he stepped forward, not abruptly, not forcefully, just enough to close the distance between us. And I did not step back, not because I could not, but because I did not want to. And that realization settled into me before I could stop it, and his voice came again, softer now, almost quiet. Then maybe nothing is ending, he said, and the words should have been confusing, should have complicated everything I had been holding on to, but instead they felt clear in a way that unsettled me more than anything else, because they did not change the facts, they changed how I saw them. And I searched his expression, looking for something that explained it, something that told me what he meant, but there was nothing there except the same quiet certainty that had always defined him. And I felt it again, that shift, that moment where things move from something defined into something else entirely. And I let out a slow breath, my voice barely above a whisper now. That was not the deal, I said, and he nodded once, like he agreed, like he understood exactly what I meant. No, he said. And then, after a pause that felt intentional, it was not. And that should have been the end of it, the confirmation I needed, the clarity I had been holding on to from the beginning. But it was not, because something else had already changed, something that was no longer defined by the deal or the time or the rules. And I felt it clearly now. That difference between leaving and wanting to leave. And I looked at him again, really looked this time. And I realized something I had been avoiding from the moment this began. The contract had an end date, but whatever this had become did not. And that was the moment everything shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, just enough to matter. And I took a step back, not to create distance, but to see it clearly, to understand what I was about to do. And I let the silence settle one last time before I spoke, my voice steady, certain in a way it had not been before. You said I was free, I said, and he held my gaze, not interrupting, not correcting, just waiting, and I nodded once, like I was confirming it for myself as much as for him. Then I choose to stay. And the words landed between us, simple, deliberate, irreversible. And for the first time since I met him, something in his expression changed in a way I could not ignore, not control, not define. And I realized then that freedom had never been about leaving. It had been about choosing, and I had just made the one decision that changed everything.